Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I also serve on the Armed Services Committee, and I'm very concerned about the military's dependence on Chinese supply chains for critical life-saving pharmaceuticals. Last year, Dr. Dunn and I, if you were here, we were trying to include in the NDA a provision that the department had to develop and implement a plan to de-risk battlefield medicine specifically from China. Unfortunately, it was dropped in conference, so it did not pass through. I'm going ahead and doing another NDA amendment this year to specifically ask them to acquire penicillin or amoxicillin, as well as 5 other key battlefield drugs that we would completely decouple from China, but also to look at stockpiling at least amoxicillin, penicillin, plus 10 additional drugs, some of which component parts come from China, again, just so that we have it there in our reserves, because I think, Dr. Wozinska, to your point, it's not just an essential list, it is actually the ones that could have the most harm if we were not able to get it. So things like amoxicillin, blood clotting medication, those types of things. And so I was very disappointed that the military came back actually and said that they could not support and they would oppose my specific amendment, feeling that they were too small in terms of being a drug purchaser within the government. This should be instead a whole of government approach, and they felt that this was something that was too small for them to do. I'm not sure, Dr. Wozinska, in your opinion, is the military too small of a buyer to make a difference when we are, again, trying to make sure that the drugs that we have in our inventory and in our stockpile are those that are of the most life-saving importance?
So thank you for this question. I think the role of DoD differs somewhat. I think there's another, sorry. The role of DoD differs, I think, and whether they're too large or too small depends on what you're considering. So for example, I think DoD is in a perfect position to be doing research to understand really where the vulnerabilities are, because they rely on exactly the same supply chains as the civilians. You know, granted, full disclosure, I'm actually a beneficiary of some of the DoD research, and some of my testimony is based on this, but it benefits us broadly. So here it's not, they aren't too small, they're perfect for this. They do have tools they have incredible sort of flexibility with procurement, and they also have a lot more money. I can't tell you how to think about their role in terms of, could they help build civilian infrastructure that would build civilians as well? That's another broader thing. Where they are limited is as a buyer. They do have only 2% of the market. So frequently we'll say if only the DoD and VA were to start signing long-term contracts, it would be transformational. I think it could be transformational for some small firms, and it could be helpful, but here I actually do agree that they themselves as a buyer are too small, but they do, in other roles, they have a really important role to play.
But essentially, as a small buyer, they could show the pathway for the rest of the whole of government to be able to secure some of these life-saving drugs. As you mentioned, if we have a stratified list that shows the top-tier priority drugs that really were necessary to save lives and have the most impact, it could also be a pathway to show how other departments and agencies should also follow in that decoupling from China.
That's right, but it would have to be followed by Congress, because to change the incentives for all the other buyers that are not that are not there, getting Medicare to do this. Senate Finance has a proposal for how to get hospitals to be taking this, to be weighing this kind of resilience much more. So yes, as a first step, absolutely agree, but Congress really does need to change the incentives outside of VA and DoD for this to really be transformational.
Thank you. I have just 2 more quick questions. The second one being, are we maximizing our role in forums like the G7 to create and execute, quite frankly, a unified pharmaceutical strategy? Because what we're talking about, to your point, being too small, America can't do this by itself. And we've got other allied countries, partners out there who are trying to also decouple the risk from China. Do you think that the G7 actually needs a unified strategy and execution plan so we can all work together to be able to decouple this risk?
So I can't speak to G7 specifically, but I absolutely agree with you that we need to be working with our allies. The example that I gave in my testimony without naming the company, there is a manufacturer in Copenhagen who is shutting down their manufacturing facility for antibiotics. This is a great opportunity for us to work with Europeans who are a little bit in sort of analysis paralysis mode themselves. They're far behind sort of where India has been leaning in, where they have actually put money and policies in place. But those are the kinds of opportunities for us to engage and work with them together. I completely agree.
Thank you. That's something I've been pushing in this particular forum, that the G7 and other forums like that need to be more of a tip of a spear in terms of how collectively we are going to work towards common threats like China. And I would just end with this rhetorical question that I've asked many times in this committee, whether or not America's ever going to get over its love for buying cheap stuff. And Ms. Wozinski, you mentioned supply reliability contracts. It's about us paying more, but understanding it's not about cheaper, it's more secure. And I think that is very applicable to the discussion today when we talk about pharmaceuticals and how we de-risk, decouple ourselves from China. We have to get over this cheap obsession and look at what is going to make us more secure as a country and taking care of our people. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
As everybody knows, the title of today's hearing, From Lab to Medicine Cabinet, How China is Cornering the Market on Our Medicines, is an important topic. And this committee has been focused on how do we win the strategic competition against China. And I don't think there's a more important space to do that than when it comes to pharmaceuticals or to medicine, and we've heard a lot about that here today. China's rapid advancements in biotechnology are increasingly challenging Americans' leadership in developing cutting-edge, life-saving pharmaceuticals. As we know, it takes 10 to 15 years and a minimum of $2 billion to turn a promising idea into a medicine that reaches pharmacy shelves and patients' homes. With costs for clinical trials in China costing up to 30% less than the United States, combined with less regulatory hurdles and faster patent recruitment, the U.S. risks losing new investments while also creating potential health and national security concerns, along with supply chain concerns. It's essential that the United States maintains its position as a global leader in the pharmaceutical innovation and recognizes that China's climb up the value chain could disrupt existing trade dynamics. Inadvertently, shifting innovation overseas weakens our domestic biotech ecosystem at a time when strategic competition is obviously intensifying. And so I look forward at this hearing from hearing more from our witnesses on how we can reinforce U.S. leadership in biomedicine innovation while protecting both patients and our long-term economic and national security interests. Dr. Beecraft, as the CEO and co-founder of Strand Therapeutics, you've led the development for the world's first synthetic biology programming program language for the mRNA. Your work underscores that life-changing innovation begins in early-stage R&D, where clinical trials are often the make-or-break moment for getting new treatments to patients. Question for you, how is the U.S. currently underutilizing our clinical infrastructure and decreasing clinical trial availability for patients who need treatments the most?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for the introduction or the welcoming as well. I think that so maybe it's easy to look at it through the perspective of an early stage cash-strapped biotechnology company who, like my colleague here has said, they've made a commitment to not work in China. As a biotechnology company, when you make the commitment to not do the clinical trial in China, you are taking on a number of costs and time overruns, which a lot of times you don't have, right? It takes longer, and it's much more expensive to run a first-in-human trial here in the United States, partially because of what I said in my opening statements and in my written testimony around the hurdles it takes to run these INDs and the expense and time at which it takes them to run here in the United States. If we're able to simplify that process, if we're able to shorten it and enable to make it much faster and much cheaper here in the United States through some of the policy pieces I outlined, I believe that we can actually increase the amount of sites in the United States that will actually run clinical trials. So if we look at it through my board's perspective, for instance, when we're running a clinical trial, we know we're in for an IND around $20 to $25 million of expense. That's just regulatory and testing to get the privilege to ask the FDA in order to run a clinical trial. That's before clinical trial expenses come into the picture. Once you're in that sort of a spend environment, of course, your board, your investors, everyone behind you is going to pressure you. If we're going to bother running the trial here in the United States, if we're going to bother spending that much money, we better go to the best places that we possibly can. And so you see a clustering of clinical trials at these high-end centers, who are amazing, of course, but we have all of these great hospitals spread throughout the United States, right? MD Anderson in Houston is incredible, but OSF in Central Illinois and in Peoria is an incredible facility with incredible infrastructure. But no one runs first-in-human trials there. And why? Because there's a sunk cost fallacy that a lot of companies do. Once you invest all that money to run those trials, you of course want to go to the Sloan Ketterings of the world. Your board wants you to go to the most famous person you can get to in the United States. If you make that an easier hurdle, if you make it a faster and cheaper amount, you not only open up the capital pools to power that, but you open up the types and places where we will run clinical trials. You create a private market incentive for those clinical trial sites to actually build the infrastructure to run first-in-human clinical trials, and you increase access to brand new, potentially life-saving medicines to patients across rural America that currently do not have any access except to get on a plane and spend what could be the last 3 months of their life in a city they've never been to before, just to have the privilege of a shot to extend their life. And that, I think, is unacceptable for America.
Dr. Wazinska, you were very direct in your recommendations. Thank you very much. You stated the U.S. cannot and should not try to buy its way out of every vulnerability in the drug supply chain. Instead, focus on a realistic de-risking strategy to reduce the most serious China-related risks to American patients. And you started your testimony, you gave us four strategic things to think about. And your first was focusing on the chemical precursors, the reagents, the solvents. They differ across drugs. Can you summarize for us what good is happening in the U.S. government right now when it comes to that recommendation, and what would you go a little deeper on your recommendations on what we should focus on?
So there are some efforts to engage. Again, I mentioned ASPR's budget. They are leaning in, but last I remember it was $30 million that was appropriated, assigned to that effort. So again, it's not enough. There are efforts, there are domestic manufacturers that are trying to de-risk their supply chains fully. We're actually lucky on the antibiotic side. It's somewhat easier to fully de-risk it from China because the products, the API is still made in Europe. So I believe Patrick is actually procuring his product from European facilities. So there are great opportunities. The first steps are actually not chemically synthesized, they're fermented. So there's a lot of action going on over there. We are thinking about stockpiling API to buy us time in case of a crisis. There are efforts, actually going back to NIH, there are some researchers in Stanford that have developed a way to synthesize to basically grow API in yeast, so entirely avoiding chemical synthesis. And now they're licensing it to a number of manufacturers and are working with one of them to actually entirely sidestep chemical synthesis. So there are pockets that are really important, really great, but not at the scale that we would want. And again, this is where we need Congress to step in.
And FDA has an indispensable role here as well. And I know at the Energy and Commerce Committee, where I also serve, we're kind of debating the future of the FDA. They've done critical work in predicting and responding to shortages, overall shortages in the past. but they have very limited authorities, and access to certain manufacturing data is very, very opaque. You previously worked as the Director of Economics at FDA, and one of the things I look at the current administration that I think is so harmful when it comes to everything that we want to do and invest in, unfortunately, when you look at FDA to help better arm them and help address shortages, is that the administration eliminated over 3,500 positions at the FDA. That's 15 to 20% of the overall workforce. What impact will that have on America's ability to tackle some of these problems?
So I am actually not aware of how the extent to which the cuts actually affected the staff at the drug shortage team and those that support it. What I can say where FDA is very limited and has been limited for a really long time is on manufacturing quality oversight. And you know, something that I would like to clarify, I am concerned about the manufacturing quality of products that are coming from India. But when I suggest that we should work with India, I don't necessarily mean that we somehow swipe this under the rug. I do think that there are other ways that we can pursue that to support FDA. It's not just about giving FDA more staff, although this is really important so they can do the inspections. You know, FDA is sort of like a traffic cop trying to enforce speed limits, and you know, they can only be in so many places, and they're also visible on the freeway a mile away. So we need to sort of think differently about how we support FDA in this effort, and I have actually last October proposed a solution to this that would shift a lot more accountability towards Indian manufacturers when it comes to manufacturing quality, really supporting FDA and allowing FDA to be much more efficient in the work that they do. And I'm happy to share that proposal.
Good, I'll look forward to that. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Jimenez, thank you so much for being here today and kind of giving your perspective on the venture capital and the business side of how this all intersects. And we know that consistent improvement in the coordination across public and private sectors is absolutely critical to making sure that we can maintain a resilient posture in the pharmaceutical manufacturing and biotech space. So we know not one sector can do it alone. Clearly, we're hearing today about how interconnected they are. So my question to you today is, what does in your mind, going forward, a successful partnership look like between the private sector and then state, local, federal partners to make sure that we are not only amplifying production for critical APIs, but also making sure we're not ceding that manufacturing ability as well?
So with respect to manufacturing, I'll kind of cede to my colleagues here who spend a lot more time thinking directly about that. That said, the best things that we can do is strengthen the relationship between the FDA and kind of our research communities right now, as well as our clinical research facilities that are generally funded by government grants.
And by strengthening the relationship, what is your idea there on how that needs to improve? I mean, you talk about the time, right?
Yeah.
I heard you mention, let's get to 5 years, which would be great.
Yeah.
But what else do you think needs to happen to improve that relationship?
So I think the FDA being much more open to getting to first-in-human clinical data is incredibly important. And so we can follow the examples, not just of China, but actually through Australia and their CTM programs that allow people to get into clinical data and first-in-human data quickly. I think we can do that also by, as Jake has alluded to, allowing investigator-initiated trials, which is really the true mechanism that's working within China right now. Investigator-initiated trials are when clinical research institutions run trials and sponsor those trials, as opposed to private companies. And what that does is it allows a trial sponsor, who is generally going to be a well-trained expert in the field, to run a clinical trial and gather clinical data. What has happened in China is that is the actual mechanism that people are running these fast trials, and that is not a mechanism that we've really fully elaborated on in the United States. It's done, but it's not done to the extent. And so allowing our NIH and our granting agencies into clinical research facilities, and also giving the FDA the authority to accept data from there and move into fast clinical trials there is one thing that the government could be doing that'd be fantastic. And then we'll take care of the rest. The private sector can fund in this data.
And do you think that actually saves money in the long run as well? I mean, if that collaboration is able to happen, not only it's about speed, truly like a warp speed operation, right? But do you think that will make its way down to the consumer on saving money on these drug prices as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the best way we've ever seen prices go down is with more competition. And more competition comes from the greater ability for many companies to test these things out and bring drugs to market. We often cite this $1 to $3 billion to get a drug to approval. If we drop that to 5 years, that number necessarily has to go down, and investment can be much more into many more high-risk activities that would be beneficial to more Americans.
Yeah, and I see you nodding your head. Do you have anything to add there? Obviously, I mean, driving down prices is one thing, but speed is another, and competition is another. So I think you agree with all those things.
I do, and if I can just say, there's sort of two different pieces of calculus to think about here. One is, of course, the time and the money. Whenever anyone makes an investment, whether it's a company like mine, an investment firm like Francisco's, they're thinking about risk reward, right? And if the risk is exorbitantly high because of the time and cost it takes to develop a medicine, then either the reward needs to be exceptionally large, or you need to decrease the risk in another sort of way, and that's where we get with this high cost and long time of development. We get a lot of new medications that are being tested that are next logical steps forward instead of radical steps forward, right? Our goal with drug development should be to keep patients out of the hospital. That is where we will actually find, regardless of drug pricing, we will find the highest healthcare savings writ large if we keep patients out of the hospital and if we keep people alive. That is better for patients, it's better for America. If you want to take those radical steps forward, then we need to radically change the calculus of the risk that investors, both companies and investment firms, are making on those drugs, and we can start tackling things as ambitious as aging. Thank you.
To all the witnesses for being here today. It is important that the American people hear this testimony today. It's important for them to understand that the Chinese Communist Party plays a crucial role, an adversarial role, and a threat that will affect and impact every American life. This conversation is about something simple but essential: the medicines that keep our citizens healthy and the system that produces them. More than 60%, as you guys know, of American adults, nearly 90% of seniors, and nearly 25% of children fill a prescription at least one time per year. The United States has historically led the world in medical innovation, and that leadership didn't happen by accident. It grew from the people of our nation who value scientific inquiry, intellectual property, and respect the dignity of every patient who participates in research. But the global landscape, as you guys noted today, has changed quickly. China has made biotechnology and pharmaceuticals a national priority, and their goal is clear: to increase their capabilities to compete with and ultimately surpass American firms. We can see this just in recent data. Let me give you one example. In 2014, if we go back and look, China conducted about just over 1,800 clinical trials, while the United States led the world with over 7,200 clinical trials. Less than a decade later, in 2023, China had expanded to over 11,000 clinical trials, surpassing the 7,500 trials conducted in the United States. That's a telling and very significant statistic, many more. Today, for certain essential generic medicines, China is already the dominant or sometimes the sole producer of key active pharmaceutical ingredients. Mr. Chairman, this is why American leadership in new and emerging pharmaceutical technologies is critical. Innovation is America's strength. It always has been, and we must ensure that the U.S. continues to spur that for the American people. Mr. Jimenez, I want to start with you. China, under its Made in China 2025 initiative, has aggressively pursued leadership in biopharmaceutical development and manufacturing. As a result, licensing agreements for early-stage Chinese medicines have grown from below $100 million in 2020 to more than $800 million in 2024. As China continues to scale its capacity in novel drug development, many view this as a direct challenge to U.S. leadership. What specific steps should Congress take to ensure that the U.S. remains the global hub for early-stage biopharmaceutical innovation and venture investment, rather than ceding that leadership to China?
So Again, I have an audacious goal, which I think many of my colleagues will push back on, but I think we have to speed up a process that you can go from molecular discovery through approved drug while retaining the highest possible standard that the FDA has held globally. And everything I suggest is mechanisms to get there. That's going to be faster paths to first-in-human trials. Once you have human proof of concept, the finance community will rally behind and fund these things as quickly as possible. It is very easy to raise money for a company that has a drug that we feel works. Then it's going to be better systems for the FDA to move more quickly on review. That means both in terms of labor and staffing and training, but it also means in terms of technological innovation. The FDA also has probably the largest trove in history of any kind of research materials. So if a company fails and it goes under, all of that information disappears into the ether unless somebody kept it in their minds. The FDA holds that. They have the single greatest set of intellectual property with respect to life sciences medicine. And so using that and enabling that into companies, I think, is going to be hugely important.
Yeah, I think of it a lot like the course of water. If you let water go, it's going to naturally find the easiest path through to its objective. Mr. Beecraft mentioned this earlier about the blockades we put up. It just incentivizes companies to go somewhere else or to do something different. They're going to shift and take the easier path through on research and development to get to the end goal that they need to. So we need to take away those unnecessary blockades. We need to keep safety in place, no question, but we have gone way overboard in doing that. Let's talk about ethics for a second. In the U.S. clinical trials, I'm going to come to you, Mr. Cashman, on this. In the U.S., clinical trials operate under strict ethical guidelines. Patients must give informed and voluntary consent before participating in research. Their dignity and their rights are protected throughout. That commitment is foundational to how we conduct medical research. But reports indicate that the same safeguards are not always present. In fact, very few times are they present in China's clinical trial system. Mr. Cashman, given the differences in clinical trial standards and the rapid growth in pharmaceutical research activity in China, why should these developments create greater urgency for the U.S. and our allies to strengthen pharmaceutical innovation and production at home to make sure that it's safe?
Congressman, I want to make sure I understand your question. I'm focused on manufacturing, not clinical trials, and just really want to understand what you're asking.
Yeah, so China doesn't put near the guidelines around protecting humans through clinical trials as the United States does. So why is it important then to make sure that we are continuing to lead in that area? Because frankly, I can answer the question. It's pretty easy when you throw it up there. If we do not lead, we're going to cede this to somebody that doesn't care about the ethics of human life, doesn't value human life the way the United States does. And so that's the point I'm trying to make, and I'd love for you to make a final comment, and then I'm going to yield back to the chairman.
Let me focus on what I know best, and that's manufacturing. And I know there is a huge difference in how the FDA views domestic manufacturing facilities compared to international facilities like those in China and India. We can be inspected at any time. The FDA can show up at our doorstep any moment. And we have to receive them, and we do, and we welcome them, and we appreciate their input in our facility. We know in China that they have to give up to 12 days advance notice, which allows those companies to make corrections or hide some things they might not want the FDA to see. And that's just not a level playing field, and it's not good for the safety and security of the medications that we get from those nations.
But the issue of Chinese influence on our domestic pharmaceutical supply chain is important for us lawmakers to understand, and we must consider targeted returns to counter this influence. Absolutely true. I've heard from constituent companies that struggle to stay competitive with Chinese companies due to misaligned incentives in our healthcare ecosystem. That's why I launched the American-Made Medicines Caucus with Representative Carter and Representative Tenney. It's important that we pursue policies to incentivize domestic manufacturing, particularly as we face rising affordability concerns in the U.S. We've also seen safety concerns with many drugs made abroad. American patients should be able to access safe and effective American-made medicines without breaking the bank. Next year, the Energy and Commerce Committee, which I serve on, has the opportunity to pursue targeted FDA reforms through the prescription generic drug user fee reauthorizations. As a senior member of the committee, the Healthcare Subcommittee, I look forward to this critical work in the next few months. So my first question is for Dr. Beecroft. You have deep knowledge, sir, of the complex world of drug development. What are your recommendations to Congress to maintain our leadership in the biopharmaceutical space, either through FDA process or CMS reimbursement reforms?
So focus on the pieces I've talked around within my both written testimony and oral piece. I think that the thing that is the most critical for early stage discovery is that timeline to first in human data. Right? How does either an academic researcher or an entrepreneur or a hybrid of both take an idea and go from I think this could work, this could change how we treat X disease, to now I know that it may work. I have human data in hand. Every animal model, every mouse, every cell culture in a dish will never, at least not in the next 5 to 10 years, be able to recapitulate the complexity of human disease to a way that it can get us an answer that the investment community will then stand behind it. And so there's, in my experience, 2 different major roadblocks to that. There is the regulatory pathway and how we get there, and I've in my written testimony laid out ways that I think the FDA could work hand in hand to simplify that process, to decentralize the process, maintain rigorous safety oversight and notification among the agency, while allowing institutional review boards or centralized IRBs, as the current director of the FDA has spoken about reform a number of times in the past months. If we're able to decentralize that approval to the first-in-human pathway, that would massively both increase the amount of clinical sites that we could do first-in-human trials at and decrease the cost and time to that data. The second piece of this puzzle is, especially for complex medicines, how and where are we going to manufacture them? I think that both how gets to what are the regulations around what do we need to know, what do we need to assay, what do we need to measure about these medicines to think that they're safe to put into patients as often a last-ditch effort to save these patients' lives. I think there's a lot of roundtable incentive that private industry and the FDA could get around to say what is the correct level of oversight for this GMP, what's called GMP, which is how these drugs are manufactured. That sort of oversight for our companies, and to create a more open dialogue so we can all learn together. A lot of the institutional knowledge around that manufacturing is locked inside of private companies. The FDA is doing their absolute best to keep up with it, but more dialogue, I think, would increase the rate of learning and allow the FDA to more effectively work with companies to figure out what we need to do to make sure that we're putting safe drugs into patients. If we incentivize the build out of that small scale manufacturing here in the United States, usually geographically located somewhere near where we may be running clinical trials, that also massively increases the logistics, the efficiency of manufacturing to clinical testing, and it serves as a flywheel for private industry to continue to invest in the build out of domestic biomanufacturing. Once you have a manufacturing process set for that first trial, it is much more in your favor to continue building that out than to outsource as you get to a later stage and you need to make more drug or more diverse drugs. Once we start with that seed here for these advanced medications, we will then see that pay dividends into the future. Thank you.
I've been on the front lines as a counterintelligence officer fighting against China for over the last 2 decades. And I think we all recognize when China starts to dominate in any sector, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's innovation, critical minerals, it becomes an unfair advantage they gain, particularly when it comes to healthcare and biotech. So let's be clear, the United States becoming reliant on China for key ingredients of our generic medicines and the infrastructure that drives drug innovation is a loss for everybody. This panel has been fantastic in highlighting that this is bad for both patients, for physicians, and it's a bipartisan issue that I think we all want to get after solutions for. I represent a rural district in Iowa with an urban core, and in every town and every community, we believe that life-saving innovations, championing what helps Iowa across the country, is a success story that we're able to drive here at home. Strengthening U.S. drug innovation and reducing our dependency on China is a direct opportunity to improve health care for all Americans. Right now, as we noted, China has a dangerous advantage over our essential generic drugs. For example, about 90% of global API supply for generic antibiotics originates or depends on Chinese manufacturing. Ensuring we keep innovation and clinical trials here at home instead of in China means having confidence that diabetes patients have access to critical antibiotics, no matter what's happening geopolitically in the world. And that cancer patients have the opportunity to be first in line for a life-saving drug, not overseas. Keeping these clinical trial opportunities in our communities improves health outcomes and increases specialized care. It's not just about our patients either. We have research and capabilities that are strong in America. Every federal dollar invested in biotech here at home generates more than 150% return for local economic activity. I'll highlight in 2025, federal research dollars support over 2,000 jobs in Iowa, nearly $485 million in economic activity. This is a win-win-win. This fight with China isn't only about national security, it's about keeping Americans healthy, keeping innovation in the United States, and keeping jobs in our community. So with that, I want to talk to the leader of Strand Technologies. Dr. Beechcraft, you highlighted some of the real challenges that we're trying to get after here and the tragic impacts of cancer on communities across the country. I'll note that diseases like cancer don't impact everyone in the same way, but in my home state of Iowa, Palo Alto County has the second highest rate of cancer in the country. Equally, in my district, Jefferson County has one of the lowest cancer rates in Iowa. It's well below the national average. This disparity is deeply concerning, but it also gives us reason for hope. It means that we can take real actionable steps to improve patient outcomes. And I think everyone in this room agrees that no matter where you are, you deserve the opportunity to have access to cutting-edge materials, like the research that you have done that's so encouraging for us. And a perfect example of that is what the University of Iowa, which conducts more than 200 clinical trials, many of them cancer-related, are supporting not only thousands of jobs, spurring millions in the economy, but they're saving lives. Which leads me to my question. What would it mean if all this went out the door? If all of it was reshored on China, and if our ecosystem sent most of our early-stage clinical development to Beijing instead of right in the heart of America?
So this is, thank you, Congressman. This is what has been going on in the biotech sector. And a lot of our, the rate of increase of early stage clinical development is increasingly going to China. First with US biotechnology companies going to China to run their early stage clinical development programs. But now, and as we've seen time and time again with Chinese economic competition, Chinese domestic competitors now spinning up to run their own trials directly, selling those into America. Americans, by revenue, either from private insurers or from Medicare and Medicaid and the U.S. government directly, account for roughly 50% of global drug revenues. So as the center of gravity of drug development and drug sales shifts to China, it is the U.S. citizen that is footing the bill for that, either through their taxes or through their private insurance, because in whatever way you model the cash payments, they go out the door. Not only do I think that we can compete with them by reforming some of our early clinical trials for a district like yours in Iowa, which borders my home state of Illinois, we know that we have incredible clinical resources, incredible clinical centers. No one runs early stage break-in clinical trials at those centers because of the cost and time it takes to run a clinical trial. Often, once you're in the hole for $20 to $30 million just to get a clinical trial started, your board, your investors, everyone around the table wants you to go to the most famous institution you can. If you reformed that, if it was 6 months and $5 million to get that, and you allowed these clinical sites to work more regularly with companies like mine, you would see a greater spread. And in fact, when Australia reformed their early stage first-in-human trials to the clinical trial notification system, that's exactly what we saw. We saw the private sector build centralized IRBs, which allowed a greater spread to more hospital groups. And you would find that people like my family who grew up in central Illinois, who lives there to this day, if they were to be diagnosed diagnosed with a cancer that had no standard of care left to have, their options would be to spend the remaining years of their life in a city they had never been to before in order to access a clinical trial or accept their fate. And I think that as the richest and most powerful country in the world, America, that is unacceptable.
Dr. B. Kraft could not agree more. And just to highlight this as our closing argument, this is already happening. Phase 1 and Phase 2 has already fled to China. Let's not let Phase 3 happen, because the reality is all of us will be in a harder place. Thank you very much for your testimony today. I yield back my time.